Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has spent more than 3 decades on the highest court in the land, wielding enormous power over American law and life. Known for his conservative judicial philosophy, his rare public statements, and his unwillingness to ask questions during oral arguments for years at a time, Thomas has cultivated an image of austere authority that few dare to challenge directly. When he speaks publicly about constitutional matters or the role of the judiciary, his words carry the weight of institutional power that can shape legal debates for generations. That made what happened at a recent constitutional law symposium all the more remarkable. Justice Thomas had been invited as the keynote speaker to discuss his judicial philosophy and his views on constitutional interpretation. Among the panelists invited to participate in the discussion session following his address was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who had been asked to provide perspective on how congressional lawmakers view the relationship between the legislative and judicial branches. What was intended as a respectful academic discussion turned into a tense confrontation when Thomas attempted to use his institutional authority to dismiss Crockett's concerns about recent Supreme Court decisions affecting voting rights and civil liberties. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, but those minutes revealed a fundamental clash between judicial power and democratic accountability. Thomas clearly expected that his position on the Supreme Court would command deference and that his interpretations of constitutional law would go unchallenged by a freshman member of Congress. Crockett had different expectations. She responded to Thomas with a combination of legal precision and moral clarity that left him visibly uncomfortable and unable to dismiss her arguments as easily as he apparently anticipated. The moment instantly went viral and sparked intense debate about the proper relationship between the Supreme Court and the elected branches of government. Before we examine exactly what Thomas said that prompted Crockett's response, how she managed to silence one of the most powerful jurists in America in mere seconds, and why this exchange matters for understanding the current tensions around the Supreme Court's role in American democracy, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed about these crucial constitutional debates. Now let us break down how Jasmine Crockett stood up to Supreme Court power and delivered a response that Thomas could not effectively counter. Clarence Thomas represents a particular vision of constitutional interpretation and judicial authority that has shaped American law for more than 30 years. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 1991 after contentious confirmation hearings, Thomas has become the most consistently conservative voice on the court and arguably its most influential member in moving constitutional law in a conservative direction. His judicial philosophy emphasizes what he describes as originalism, the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted according to its original public meaning at the time of ratification. This approach has led him to take positions that frequently challenge established precedents and expand conservative interpretations of individual rights, property rights, and limits on federal power. Thomas is known for several distinctive characteristics that set him apart even among conservative jurists. He writes separately in many cases, often going further than even his conservative colleagues in articulating how he believes constitutional law should develop. He has called for reconsidering and overturning numerous established precedents that he views as wrongly decided, including decisions that have protected voting rights, reproductive rights, and various other individual liberties. He rarely speaks during oral arguments, maintaining a silence that contributes to his image as someone above the ordinary give and take of legal argument. When he does speak publicly, his words carry enormous weight within conservative legal circles. The Constitutional Law Symposium, where this confrontation occurred, represented an unusual setting for Thomas. Supreme Court justices typically avoid direct engagement with elected officials about specific cases or controversial legal issues, preferring to maintain institutional distance that preserves the appearance of neutrality. However, Thomas had agreed to participate in this academic forum focused on constitutional interpretation, apparently viewing it as an opportunity to explain his judicial philosophy to a broader audience including lawmakers, legal scholars, and students. Jasmine Crockett brought a very different set of experiences and perspectives to the symposium. As a civil rights attorney before entering Congress, she had worked on cases directly affected by Supreme Court decisions on voting rights, criminal justice, and civil liberties. She understood constitutional law not as abstract theory, but as lived reality for her clients and constituents who experienced the practical effects of judicial interpretations. Her legal training gave her the technical knowledge to engage with complex constitutional arguments, while her political role gave her a platform to speak on behalf of communities whose rights and interests were at stake in constitutional disputes. The stakes of this encounter extended far beyond the personal interaction between Thomas and Crockett. The Supreme Court had recently issued several controversial decisions that dramatically reshaped voting rights law, reproductive rights, environmental regulation, and other areas of profound importance to millions of Americans. These decisions had been decided along ideological lines, with the conservative majority led by justices like Thomas overturning decades of precedent and imposing new constitutional interpretations that many critics viewed as politically motivated rather than legally required. Congressional Democrats had been searching for effective ways to respond to these decisions and to the broader question of Supreme Court accountability. Some had proposed court expansion, term limits for justices, or ethics reforms to address concerns about conflicts of interest and the influence of wealthy donors on judicial decision-making. But these proposals faced significant political and practical obstacles. Meanwhile, the court's conservative majority continued issuing decisions that reshaped American law in ways that Democrats and many legal scholars viewed as inconsistent with democratic values and constitutional text. The symposium discussion represented an opportunity for direct engagement between a Supreme Court justice and an elected representative about these fundamental questions of judicial power and democratic accountability. Thomas apparently viewed the setting as friendly territory where his institutional authority and legal expertise would command automatic respect, and where challenges to his positions could be easily deflected. Crockett understood that this rare opportunity for direct dialogue carried both risks and potential rewards. A weak performance would reinforce perceptions that the court was beyond effective challenge. A strong performance could demonstrate that judicial authority was not absolute, and that elected representatives could hold even Supreme Court justices accountable for the effects of their decisions. The symposium began conventionally enough, with Justice Thomas delivering a prepared address explaining his approach to constitutional interpretation. He spoke about the importance of adhering to the original meaning of constitutional text rather than allowing judges to impose their own policy preferences under the guise of interpretation. He argued that this approach provided stability and predictability in law and prevented unelected judges from usurping the democratic process. His remarks were well received by the conservative legal scholars and students in attendance, who applauded his defense of originalism and judicial restraint. The question and answer session that followed included several respectful inquiries from law professors and students seeking clarification on aspects of Thomas's judicial philosophy. Thomas responded with detailed explanations of how he approached specific constitutional questions and how his methodology differed from other approaches like living constitutionalism or pragmatic balancing. The tone remained academic and cordial, with Thomas appearing comfortable and authoritative in explaining his views. When Jasmine Crockett's turn came to pose a question, the dynamic shifted immediately. She began by noting that she represented a district in Texas where voting rights had been significantly affected by recent Supreme Court decisions, particularly the court's decision in Shelby County that gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. She described how her constituents had experienced the practical effects of that decision through polling place closures, reduced early voting hours, and stricter identification requirements that made voting more difficult, particularly for elderly voters, poor voters, and voters of color. Crockett then posed her question. She asked Justice Thomas how his originalist approach to the Constitution squared with the reality that the original Constitution did not protect voting rights for most Americans, including women and African Americans. She noted that constitutional protections for voting rights came through amendments and legislation passed long after the founding, often over fierce opposition from those who claimed to be defending the original constitutional design. She asked whether originalism meant returning to a time when voting rights were far more restricted than they are today, or whether his judicial philosophy could accommodate the expansion of democratic participation that had occurred through constitutional change and civil rights legislation. The question was pointed but respectful, delivered in a tone that made clear Crockett was genuinely interested in understanding how Thomas reconciled his interpretive methodology with the history of voting rights in America. The audience leaned forward, recognizing that this was a more challenging question than the previous inquiries had been. Thomas's response would reveal how he handled direct questioning about the real-world implications of his judicial philosophy. Thomas's initial response was to suggest that Crockett misunderstood his position. He said that originalism did not mean ignoring constitutional amendments or returning to practices that existed before those amendments were ratified. Rather, it meant interpreting the text of the Constitution, including its amendments, according to their original public meaning. He suggested that, properly understood, originalism was perfectly compatible with expanded voting rights because those rights were now embedded in constitutional text through the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments. Crockett was prepared for this response. She followed up by noting that the Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court had significantly weakened, was not a constitutional amendment but rather legislation passed by Congress under its constitutional authority to enforce the 15th Amendment. She asked whether Thomas believed that the court should defer to congressional judgments about what enforcement mechanisms were necessary to protect voting rights, or whether unelected judges should substitute their own judgment for that of elected representatives who had studied the issue extensively and heard from affected communities. This follow-up question struck at a fundamental tension in Thomas's judicial philosophy. He claimed to favor judicial restraint and deference to democratic decision-making, yet his votes had consistently struck down or weakened legislation passed by Democratic majorities to protect voting rights and other civil liberties. Thomas responded by saying that judicial review was an essential constitutional function and that courts had an obligation to invalidate legislation that exceeded congressional authority or violated constitutional limits, regardless of how well-intentioned the legislation might be. Crockett pressed further. She noted that Thomas and his colleagues had invalidated key provisions of the Voting Rights Act not because they violated any specific constitutional prohibition, but because the court majority believed that the preclearance requirement was no longer necessary given changed conditions in states with histories of voting discrimination. She pointed out that Congress had extensively documented ongoing discrimination when it reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, and that the decision to override that congressional judgment represented judicial activism rather than judicial restraint. The exchange was becoming increasingly tense. Thomas's responses grew shorter and his tone more defensive. He suggested that Crockett was conflating policy disagreements with legal questions, and that the proper interpretation of the Constitution sometimes required invalidating popular legislation. He implied that as a member of Congress, she might not fully appreciate the distinct role of the judiciary in constitutional interpretation. This comment gave Crockett the opening she had been waiting for. She responded that as a practicing attorney who had litigated constitutional cases, and as an elected representative who had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, she understood the judiciary's role quite well. She noted that the Constitution does not appear anywhere in the text to give the Supreme Court final and unreviewable authority over constitutional meaning. She pointed out that judicial review, while now well established, was itself a court-created doctrine not explicitly found in constitutional text, which raised interesting questions about whether an originalist approach should even recognize the strong form of judicial supremacy that Thomas seemed to assume. Several audience members gasped audibly at this line of argument. Crockett was directly challenging not just Thomas's specific interpretations but the foundational assumption of Supreme Court supremacy over constitutional questions. Thomas appeared taken aback, not having expected such a fundamental challenge to judicial authority from a member of Congress. His expression suggested he was calculating how to respond to an argument that questioned the very legitimacy of the court's role in the constitutional system. What happened next would be discussed and debated in constitutional law circles for months to come. Justice Thomas attempted to reassert his authority by invoking Marbury v. Madison and the long-established tradition of judicial review. He suggested that questioning the legitimacy of judicial review at this point in history was not a serious legal argument, but rather political frustration with unfavorable decisions. He implied that Crockett's challenge reflected a misunderstanding of basic constitutional structure, but Crockett was ready for this response too, and her rejoinder came so quickly and with such precision that it left Thomas momentarily speechless. She noted that she had not questioned whether courts could engage in judicial review, only whether the Supreme Court possessed exclusive and final authority to determine constitutional meaning to the exclusion of the political branches. She pointed out that many constitutional scholars, including some prominent conservative legal thinkers, had argued for departmentalism, the view that each branch of government has independent authority to interpret the Constitution within its own sphere. She then delivered the line that would go viral and be quoted in legal commentary for days afterward. She said that if Justice Thomas truly believed in originalism and judicial restraint, he should recognize that the Constitution gives Congress enumerated powers to legislate, gives the President authority to execute the laws, and gives the courts jurisdiction over cases and controversies. Nowhere does it say that 5 or 6 unelected justices can overrule the democratic judgments of the people's representatives on fundamental questions of rights and governance. She said that what Thomas called judicial review looked increasingly like judicial supremacy, where the court's interpretation became the Constitution itself rather than being one interpretation subject to democratic contestation. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas sat frozen, clearly not having anticipated such a sophisticated constitutional argument delivered with such force and clarity. Other panelists looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to jump in or let the moment stand. Audience members were completely still, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. A freshman member of Congress had just delivered a fundamental challenge to Supreme Court authority directly to one of its longest-serving justices, using arguments that could not be easily dismissed as political grandstanding or legal ignorance. Thomas eventually responded, but his answer lacked the confidence and authority of his earlier remarks. He said that the American constitutional system had operated for more than 2 centuries on the understanding that the Supreme Court was the authoritative interpreter of the Constitution, and that departing from that understanding would create chaos and uncertainty. He suggested that whatever the theoretical arguments about departmentalism, the practical reality was that someone had to have final say on constitutional questions, and that role had been filled by the judiciary. Crockett countered that the chaos Thomas worried about might be preferable to the alternative of unchecked judicial power. She noted that the court had been wrong before, disastrously so in cases like Dred Scott and Plessy v. Ferguson, and that the political branches and social movements had eventually corrected those errors. She said that treating the court's interpretations as final and unreviewable removed an essential check on judicial overreach and insulated justices from accountability for decisions that affected millions of Americans who had no say in their selection and no recourse when they made rulings that violated democratic values or constitutional text. She then shifted to the specific issue of voting rights that had started the exchange. She noted that Congress had the constitutional authority to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments through appropriate legislation. The Voting Rights Act represented Congress's judgment about what enforcement mechanisms were necessary to protect the voting rights of minority citizens. The Supreme Court's decision to invalidate key portions of that law represented the court substituting its judgment for Congress's judgment about how to enforce constitutional rights. She asked Thomas whether he believed that the constitutional grant of enforcement power to Congress meant anything if the court could simply override congressional judgments whenever a majority of justices disagreed with them. Thomas's response was to say that the court's role was to ensure that Congress acted within constitutional limits, and that the Voting Rights Act's preclearance requirement had exceeded those limits by treating some states differently than others without sufficient justification. Crockett immediately challenged this characterization. She noted that Congress had extensively documented ongoing discrimination in covered jurisdictions when it reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, and that the different treatment of different states was based on their different records of voting discrimination, which seemed like a perfectly rational basis for tailored legislation. She then delivered her final challenge. She said that Justice Thomas and the court majority had essentially declared that racism in voting was no longer a significant problem, contrary to the extensive congressional findings, and despite ongoing evidence of discriminatory voting restrictions. She asked whether Thomas believed that he and his colleagues sitting in Washington and reviewing abstract legal arguments were better positioned to assess the reality of voting discrimination than members of Congress who had heard from affected communities, examined detailed evidence, and represented diverse constituencies across the country. The question exposed the fundamental democratic deficit at the heart of judicial supremacy. Thomas had no good answer. He could not claim that unelected justices with life tenure were more democratically legitimate than elected representatives. He could not convincingly argue that the court had better information about voting discrimination than Congress had gathered through extensive hearings and investigations. He fell back on the assertion that constitutional interpretation was a legal question requiring legal expertise, but this just circled back to Crockett's earlier point about whether any institution should have final and unreviewable authority over constitutional meaning. Recognizing that the exchange had moved beyond the bounds of typical academic discussion and that Thomas was not going to concede any points, the symposium moderator intervened to thank both Thomas and Crockett for their contributions and to move on to other topics. But the damage had been done from Thomas's perspective. He had been challenged directly and forcefully by a member of Congress who demonstrated sophisticated understanding of constitutional law and who refused to defer to his judicial authority. His responses had been defensive and unconvincing, failing to adequately answer the fundamental questions about democratic accountability and judicial overreach that Crockett had raised. The confrontation between Justice Thomas and Congresswoman Crockett dominated legal and political media for days following the symposium. Video clips of their exchange went viral, shared widely across social media platforms by people from across the political spectrum. Progressive activists celebrated Crockett for standing up to Supreme Court power and articulating concerns about judicial overreach that many Americans shared, but that few elected officials had been willing to voice directly to a sitting justice. Constitutional law scholars debated the substantive questions about judicial review and departmentalism that the exchange had raised. Conservative legal commentators were divided in their responses. Some defended Thomas and criticized Crockett for what they characterized as inappropriate disrespect toward a Supreme Court justice and dangerous questioning of judicial authority. They argued that her challenges to judicial supremacy were reckless and could undermine the rule of law if taken seriously by political actors. However, other conservative scholars acknowledged that Crockett had raised legitimate questions about the proper scope of judicial power, and that Thomas's responses had not adequately addressed the tension between his stated commitment to judicial restraint and his votes to strike down democratically enacted legislation. The exchange had significant political implications for ongoing debates about Supreme Court reform. Crockett's willingness to directly challenge judicial supremacy gave cover to other Democrats who wanted to pursue more aggressive oversight of the court and potential structural reforms. Her sophisticated legal arguments demonstrated that calls for court reform were not just political grievances, but were grounded in serious constitutional concerns about accountability and democratic legitimacy. Proposals for term limits, ethics reforms, and limitations on the court's jurisdiction gained renewed attention and support. For Justice Thomas personally, the confrontation represented a rare moment of public discomfort and challenge to his authority. He had spent decades operating in an institutional environment where his position commanded automatic deference, and where his interpretations of constitutional law were treated as authoritative pronouncements. Being directly challenged by an elected official in a public forum, and struggling to provide convincing responses to her arguments, was a jarring experience that exposed the limits of judicial authority when confronted with democratic accountability. The incident also affected how the Supreme Court as an institution was perceived by the public. Opinion polls showed growing concern about the court's legitimacy, and whether it was acting as a neutral arbiter of constitutional questions or as a political institution pursuing ideological goals. The image of Justice Thomas unable to effectively defend his positions against challenges from an elected representative reinforced perceptions that the court's conservative majority was vulnerable to democratic accountability, and that its authority rested more on institutional power than on the persuasiveness of its legal reasoning. Legal scholars began more seriously examining the theoretical and practical questions about judicial supremacy that Crockett had raised. Academic conferences featured panels on departmentalism and coordinate construction, theories of constitutional interpretation that give each branch of government independent authority to interpret the Constitution, rather than treating the Supreme Court's interpretations as final. Law review articles explored historical examples of political branches refusing to accept judicial interpretations as conclusive and considered whether such resistance might be appropriate in contemporary circumstances. The confrontation also influenced how other members of Congress approached oversight of the judiciary. Emboldened by Crockett's example, several representatives and senators became more willing to publicly criticize specific Supreme Court decisions and to question the legitimacy of the court's claim to final interpretive authority. Congressional hearings on judicial ethics and court reform featured more aggressive questioning of the assumptions underlying judicial supremacy and more serious consideration of structural changes to make the judiciary more democratically accountable. For Jasmine Crockett personally, the exchange with Justice Thomas further elevated her national profile and established her as a leading voice on constitutional questions and judicial accountability. Legal organizations invited her to speak about the proper relationship between courts and democratic institutions. Progressive groups featured her in campaigns for court reform. Her demonstrated ability to engage with complex constitutional arguments and to hold powerful institutions accountable made her valuable to democratic leadership on judicial issues. The broader implications for American constitutional development remain contested and evolving. Some scholars argue that Crockett's challenge to judicial supremacy represents a healthy democratic response to judicial overreach and could lead to necessary reforms that make the court more accountable. Others worry that undermining respect for judicial authority could threaten the rule of law and the protection of individual rights against majority tyranny. These debates reflect fundamental tensions in American constitutionalism between democratic self-governance and legal constraints on democratic power. The exchange also highlighted the importance of legal expertise among elected officials. Crockett's effectiveness in challenging Thomas stemmed in part from her training as a lawyer and her understanding of constitutional law and theory. Her example suggested that having more attorneys with litigation experience in Congress could strengthen the legislative branch's ability to engage with the judiciary on equal intellectual footing and to exercise meaningful oversight over judicial decision-making. Media coverage of the exchange prompted broader discussions about how the press covers the Supreme Court. Many news organizations treat the court with excessive deference, reporting its decisions as authoritative pronouncements rather than as contestable interpretations that should be subject to critical examination. The confrontation between Thomas and Crockett demonstrated that vigorous democratic challenge to judicial decisions was possible and appropriate, encouraging more critical journalism about the court's work. Civil rights organizations took particular interest in the exchange because of its focus on voting rights and the practical effects of Supreme Court decisions on marginalized communities. Crockett's insistence on connecting constitutional interpretation to real-world impacts on real people resonated with advocates who had long argued that the court's abstract legal reasoning ignored the lived experiences of those affected by its decisions. The exchange became a touchstone for arguments that judicial decision-making should be more accountable to democratic input and more attentive to empirical evidence about the effects of legal rules. Looking ahead, the confrontation between Justice Thomas and Congresswoman Crockett may be remembered as a turning point in debates about judicial power and democratic accountability. It demonstrated that the Supreme Court's claim to supreme interpretive authority is not beyond question, and that elected representatives can effectively challenge that claim using sophisticated constitutional arguments. Whether this moment leads to actual reforms in the structure or operation of the judiciary remains to be seen, but it has already shifted the terms of debate in ways that make such reforms more politically feasible than they were before. The exchange also serves as a reminder that institutional power is not the same as moral or intellectual authority. Justice Thomas's position on the Supreme Court gave him enormous legal power to shape American law, but it did not protect him from being challenged when his reasoning was unconvincing or when his decisions conflicted with democratic values and constitutional text. Crockett's ability to silence Thomas even briefly showed that democratic accountability can penetrate even the most insulated institutions when representatives are willing to speak truth to power. If you want to stay informed about these fundamental debates over constitutional structure, judicial power, and democratic accountability, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. The questions that Jasmine Crockett raised in her confrontation with Clarence Thomas go to the heart of how American democracy functions and who has the ultimate authority to interpret our fundamental law. These questions will not be resolved quickly or easily, but the conversation has been opened in ways that make it harder to simply defer to judicial authority without demanding justification and accountability. Thank you for watching, and we will continue to cover these critical constitutional developments as they unfold.